Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're here with Walker Consultants, and they're going to be discussing the economic importance of managed parking and how it can impact your community. Walker Consultants is a professional services firm that employs engineers, architects, planners, and parking operations and technology specialists who deliver customized, knowledge-based services relating to forensic restoration and building envelope restoration engineering, parking and mobility planning, parking operations and technology consulting, and parking facility design. So today we've got two speakers. We've got Andrew and Mallory here. Andrew is the Director of Studies in Walker Consultants' Denver office and focuses on achievable and implementable change in the parking and transportation space. Mallory is a parking and mobility planner in Walker Consultants' Denver office and has a track record of success working with a wide range of municipalities and multi-governmental stakeholders across the Mountain West and throughout the U.S. to achieve initiatives that meet fiscal, economic, and community goals. Boy, so those are our two speakers. Before we go ahead and get started, I know we're all super excited for this. I would like to give you a quick rundown of GoToWebinar for anyone who is new. So you should have a control panel to the right of your screen. That's where you can go ahead and ask questions. We'll be monitoring those throughout the presentation today and asking throughout. So feel free to throw those in the little question box and we'll get those answered for you. This is also going to be recorded. So I will send a follow-up email afterward and you will get a link to that recording and the presentation materials. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Andrew to get us started.
Great, thanks McKenna, and thanks to the Colorado Municipal League and the attendees that are here today. We're excited to be with you. We understand this is a topic that your organization has asked for some more information on. Again, I'm Andrew Vidor. I'm our Director of Planning, Operations, and Technology based here in Colorado. I have a background degree in engineering and have been in the parking, multimodal access, and transportation space for 18 years. So I have a broad array of experience, not only here in our Colorado communities, but across the US and to Canada and the Middle East. I'm joined today by Mallory Baker. She'll introduce herself in a second. But in the middle here is a picture of part of our team that are in our Colorado office. We've been based in Colorado for almost 42 years. Our company has been in existence for 56 years, and we have offices all across the United States. So my role at Walker in serving the Mountain West is to help drive positive change for our communities to be able to provide economic vibrancy and great parking, transportation, and multimodal access to not only our residents and business owners, but the guests that come in from all over the world to experience our great state.
Awesome, thanks Andrew. Hey everybody, good afternoon. My name is Mallory Baker. I'm a planner and consultant and also serve as our National Community Engagement Lead throughout the firm. Focus primarily on the Mountain West though, and I'm super excited to talk about this topic today. In my practice as the Community Engagement Lead, I focus especially on bringing communities along in the process as we ramp up parking management efforts for the purpose of increasing economic growth and development. So again, super excited to be here, and thanks to the Colorado Municipal League and all of the attendees for being here with us this afternoon.
Thanks, Mallory. So we want you to know what the investment of your time is going to outcome from this today. We know that you made the time over to your lunch hour or just an hour of your time in general after so many other important tasks that you're doing in your communities. So we want you to know, first of all, that this will be an interactive session and there will be two opportunities to engage and share some feedback with us. So you're going to want to be able to have your phone handy to be able to access a website called menti.com. We'll give you more information about that. We're going to share some strategies and success stories from communities that you're familiar with of varying sizes within our state. We want you to know that you're not alone in this venture and endeavor that you may be dealing with and experiencing in a lot of different scalable ways. So we're going to talk about some communities that have grappled with this and been able to achieve success. We want to talk about why parking and parking management and enhancements in your towns and your communities is important, and particularly why it's important for the economic vibrancy and the successful growth of your community. And then, as we mentioned, we're going to give you that opportunity to engage with us. So you are going to want to pull out your phone and go to menti.com. In a few minutes, we'll give you some more information about that. One thing you should find from Mallory and I today is that we're super passionate about what we do, and we have purpose and we have focus and the reasons why we do this as a firm, but also as individuals and our teams that work with us to develop these strategies. And they're really focused on people and making it easier for people to reach their destinations. We recognize that in many cases, nobody's coming to our communities to park, right? We have a purpose, we have a destination in mind, whether we're going to Idaho Springs to grab a sandwich on our way to the mountains, or we're spending the weekend in a community recreating. The destination is the focus, and so we want to make it easier for people to reach those destinations. We also recognize that parking is only one form of kind of the entire transportation space, and we want to make sure that we can encourage and support other good mode choices. Today we're talking about parking, but multimodal access is an important part of this discussion. We'll touch briefly on that, but we take it in as a kind of holistic approach. And so we don't want people to have single occupancy vehicles as their only way that we're getting around in our communities. And that really talks about, how we can optimize not only our parking and transportation systems, but they need to live in harmony with each other. And it's, again, about people, right? So we want to make sure that we can improve the lives of the people that are in our communities and accessing our communities, and that will help with economic growth. And then lastly, it's one thing to plan, it's another thing to plan with the focus of being able to implement that plan and make it achievable and successful that work for our people and our community members. So that's the things that we focus on, the reasons why, and some of the passions that we have in this industry. So we talked about getting engaged. We want to learn more about who's with us today. So if you go to menti.com, there will be a code that you're going to be able to enter. And that code is the number shown in red at the bottom of the screen. It's 80966306. And when you enter that code, you're going to go to a landing page. We're joined today behind the camera with Drew Wilsey, who's one of our AICP certified planners. Drew is going to be helping us with the Menti exercise. So I've just turned over control of the screen to Drew. Again, you're going to go to Menti, www.menti.com, and enter the code 809663, and you should have a landing page that looks like the one on the screen. Our first interactive session with you is going to ask two questions. The first is, we want to know where you're located. What community, town, county are you joining us from today? And the reason we want to know that is we can make sure that we're scaling our discussions for the communities that are joining us. So we have some Front Range communities, it looks like. We have some communities from up north and the city of Boulder. Lyons is joining us. Glenwood Springs out on the western slope, Erie, Commerce City. So we have some Front Range communities too. Littleton, I see, is here. This is great because it helps us again establish the conversation we want to have. We know that Front Range communities and mountain communities in the western slope and up north and northern Colorado all have different needs. So we're going to make sure that we tailor some of our discussion to address the varying community types that are joining us today. So the next question we're interested to know about is whether or not your communities manage parking today. Now, managed parking can come in a lot of different forms. It can be as simple as posted time limits. It could be enforcing those time limits. It could be issuing residential permit programs. It could include paid parking, active curb management. So there's a wide array of strategies. We don't need to know quite yet at what level you're managing it, but it looks like a little more than half, maybe 2/3 of the 34 respondents that have participated in this survey have a managed program. So one of the things that we can focus on today, and Mallory will talk more about this, is how we have an existing managed program and what we can do to expand on that. But also there's 13 communities that are with us today that don't have an active managed program. And so what we want to do is talk to you about some of the ways at the appropriate time, of course, to kind of dip your toe in the water and find some simple solutions. So thanks for engaging with us in those first two questions. We'll go back to the presentation slides now, and then start talking a little bit more about what managed parking is, why it's important, who should manage parking and who can be affected by it. So it looks like we're back up here, and we'll talk about what managed parking can do for your community. So one of the things that we recognize is that when we talk about parking, we have a lot of different parker types. That could be our employees that work in our communities. It could be the customers, whether they're from out of town, out of state, or in the community that come to shop, spend money at our retail or our restaurants. We know that our communities have residents that live downtown and business owners. We have students in some of these communities, like the city of Fort Collins, who's with us today, has students. And so they're a different user group. And one of the things that we want to recognize is that all of those different parker types, as we view them as different individual groups, have different needs. Some of those needs are short-term parking to grab a cup of coffee, to just run into the store and pick something up on their way to their next destination. Employees tend to spend a longer period of time, 3, 4, 5 hours, 8 hours in a day with their vehicle parked in one location. And our residents clearly need to be able to access their homes, their condos, apartments, what have you. And so we want to provide access for all of those different parker types and equity for all of those different parker types, and their needs are different. So we focus on making sure that managed parking programs meets the needs of all of those different parker types. And we want to make it easy for our customers to be able to access our businesses, our stores, our coffee shops, so they have good access. And when they have good access, it makes their experience better. It tells a story to their friends, whether it's their neighbors or when they go back home because they came from out of state, to say, I was in Alamosa and let me tell you how great of an experience I had at this coffee shop or the retail store. And when those stories are told positively because they had easy access to parking, our merchants and our downtown business owners can increase their revenue, and increasing their revenue and their access to business and their sales is beneficial not only for them, but for our communities as well. And when our businesses succeed, so does the sales tax revenue that goes with it. And so we as municipalities, towns, economic development agencies can take those sales tax dollars that stay in our communities and reinvest them in programs that can enhance our parking system, can enhance and expand on our transportation networks, because we don't always want people driving and parking. We can improve our sidewalks, do street beautification projects, provide programs for merchants and businesses to grow and thrive and gain skills they need to be successful. So it's this continuous cycle that's important, and that's where our communities can thrive and why economic vibrancy is important for the community as a whole. So let's talk about customer access and business vitality some more. We talk about parking again as only one of those pieces of an active transportation network system. And so we want people to get parked if they have to drive. Again, driving isn't really the primary choice. We know that reducing single occupancy vehicle is an important task. And so strategies focus on that by a park once mentality and reduce reoccurring trips by getting them the access in our modal centers to get on a shared bike, to get on a scooter if you're in a community that offers programs like that, to let them walk and see all those downtown business fronts, or to get them parked because they came from out of a core area and put them on our public transportation systems. In our mountain communities, we know how important that is to get people on our free buses so we can reduce our vehicle emissions. We do that by providing tools and technology. And tools and technology are important to help the driver understand where they can park, to easily get there. The town of Breckenridge has an amazing digital parking wayfinding system. So when our community members or guests come into town, they can see in real time before they land in that downtown core what parking is available. So we don't have people cruising around. For those communities that have paid parking, having those mobile apps at your fingertips to easily initiate a parking session. And oh, by the way, if we want to overstay the 2 hours that we planned for because we're having such a great time, we don't have to have them go back to their vehicles to pay or go back to a pay station to pay again. They can just pull up that app and extend their stay and continue to spend money in our communities. We also want to manage turnover. And turnover is an important piece of that, providing equity and access for all parker types. We want our short-term parking spaces to be used by our customers. And so we do that so they have quick access in and out of our businesses, or close and convenient access for those trips where maybe you're carrying your goods with you, or your groceries if you're picking those up, or maybe takeout. So we do that with time limits. We actively enforce time limits so we know that there is a consequence for overstaying those intended parking areas. But we also need to have longer term parking areas for, again, people that are staying longer, for our residents, for our business owners and employees, so they still have access to our parking network, but for a longer duration of time. Paid parking is another strategy, right? So 2/3 of our communities have an active managed parking program that are joining us today. Paid parking programs are great for being able to fund active parking and mobility and transportation systems. They're not necessarily a first step for communities that don't have any parking programs, and Mallory will talk more about that. One thing to recognize, though, is paid parking programs are never intended to be cash grabs. One of the things that you'll see, and I'm sure you can, recognize and appreciate, and clearly you can probably have some frustration, is the public feedback. Again, Mallory will talk more about this, but one thing that's important is, the first comment in the newspaper or the online blog is that City X is talking about paid parking, and boy, they're just looking for money to the general fund. And that's never the case. We'll need to explain the why behind that. And again, we'll talk about that some more, but paid parking is not intended to be that. We want to reinvest in our systems and be able to provide and expand on our programs. So I'm going to turn it over to Mallory to talk more about some of the programs and ways that we've done this successfully in other communities, and the way that communities have benefited from these kind of programs.
Thanks, Andrew. So Andrew talked a lot about kind of these frontline initiatives whereby we can strengthen our parking management system to incentivize and create an environment of economic growth. But the regulatory and structural context is equally as important as these sort of frontline efforts that people can see on the ground. So number one, in many communities, and in fact, most communities in Colorado, but also nationwide, use-based parking requirements, meaning, you develop X square footage of retail, you provide Y parking. That's the norm for most zoning codes, but we really want to talk today about ways that you can graduate from these basic use-based requirements in order to create an environment of economic growth. And there are different sort of interim steps that you can take, and that's sort of the theme of this presentation is no matter where you're at in this process, there are still steps you can take to improve and expand. So starting at first, if you have use-based parking requirements, you might start to think about better aligning those use-based parking requirements with what the market actually needs and demands. So one way that we've been able to do that successfully in some communities, and I see that Brighton is here, we worked with Brighton a bit on their zoning code update related to parking, is aligning those use-based parking requirements with market-based efforts like Urban Land Institute, the Institute of Traffic Engineers, which actually quantify how much parking is actually needed for these types of uses. So that's sort of an interim step. A next step you might take is looking at differences in parking requirements in different districts or parts of your community. So many smaller communities have the same parking requirements no matter where you are developing in a city. But different cities and communities are starting to look at, hey, we really want this area to be walkable. It has better access to transit and other modes of transportation. So let's reduce those parking requirements in that district in particular, so we can strengthen that community goal. Another initiative that's sort of a further step is looking at project-wide or even district-wide shared parking initiatives. So that's leveraging the parking availability in an entire district for new development to use. And that works really well in communities and downtowns where the city has its own sort of available public parking that might be underutilized. So new development can maybe use that and leverage that, rather than building more on-site parking that might not be necessary to meet demand. And then finally, you might think about incentivizing or even regulating transportation demand management in your zoning code. So we see Denver, as an example, has a number of administrative parking reductions that are available with programmatic or infrastructure-based transportation demand management initiatives like car share, like bike share. And also the city of Denver recently passed its transportation demand management ordinance as of June 2021, which actually requires essentially all new development in the city to provide a TDM plan that will actively reduce single occupancy vehicle arrivals to the site. So those are all ways that you can sort of start to graduate from these use-based requirements to really incentivize economic growth and a cohesiveness of the public parking system. The other thing we get asked about a lot is how do we maybe have an alternative to parking requirements altogether? One way, of course, is eliminating parking minimums entirely, but if you maintain parking minimums, you can look at alternatives like an in lieu fee program, whereby developers would actually provide a certain amount of funding to the city or community that the city or community could then use to fund the public parking system. So in lieu fees is a pretty extreme way to do this. In lieu fees are typically set around the replacement cost of a parking space. So that could be $15,000 all the way up to even $30,000 and upwards for our mountain friends. So that's a pretty substantial amount of money. And in order for in lieu fee programs to work, to actually fund capital structures, the construction of parking structures, you need to have a certain development pace to create that volume of funding. So we've worked with smaller communities like the city of Fruita, like the city of Salida, to have some financial mechanisms that aren't in lieu fee programs. And we call these use fee programs, where developers can, instead of building on-site parking, maybe provide a smaller amount of money to the city or community that can be used to fund operations and maintenance costs for the existing public parking system. So that's something to consider if your development pace is a little too slow, or your developers are not able to withstand a massive, pretty substantial cost that an in lieu fee program would require. So this provides a really good segue into, overall funding options for funding a parking management system. We know that parking management systems are expensive, especially as you get into increased complexity, start to maybe use more technology in your system. So pulling from the general fund, which has to go to a lot of different community needs, isn't essentially always the best idea. So there are sort of two different categories of options when thinking about funding a parking system. The top three are focused more on the operations and maintenance, sort of day-to-day costs of funding a public parking system. Things like, using your paid parking revenues to go back into funding the system and improving the system. Parking districts, business improvement districts, and general improvement districts, primarily through a tax levy, would go through funding the operations and maintenance and improvement of the parking system within those district boundaries. So Boulder, the city of Boulder, I know they're represented here today, one of our wonderful clients, a great example of how to use both paid parking revenues and their 3 general improvement districts to fund the public parking system and pay for various transportation demand management initiatives within those district boundaries and citywide. The second category is sort of the larger funding mechanisms that can pay for actual capital costs, like building a new parking structure, for example. So our friends out in the city of Loveland, as an example, used a public-private partnership through the development of the Foundry, a new mixed-use development in that city's downtown, to partially fund a publicly available parking garage that's part of that mixed-use development. So that's a great example of a P3. And tax increment financing, leveraging the potential increase in tax base to fund capital investments is another great option that is legally justifiable in the state of Colorado, unlike our friends in Arizona who are unable to use this funding mechanism. So those two are more, geared towards actual capital funding. The top 3 are more operations and maintenance and day-to-day costs. But the primary thing that I wanted to emphasize here is really transparency is so important in any funding effort. And Andrew touched on this. We talk about cities getting lambasted for implementing paid parking and making hand over fist money. The city council is using the paid parking revenues to go on great vacations to Whistler or something. No, that's not the case. The transparency of any funding mechanism is really important, and using messaging and communications efforts with your community to say, establish mutual benefit and really say, hey, we're using these revenues in these tangible ways to make your lives easier, make parking easier, maybe even fund some active transportation infrastructure improvements, transit passes, et cetera. And I think Boulder has been really excellent in doing that work. So how can we move towards managed parking? We saw that about 1/3 of our attendees today are really just starting their parking management journey or maybe thinking about it, hopefully, fingers crossed. Some other folks are maybe a little bit farther along in that process. So Andrew mentioned, we talk about parking management and folks automatically jump to paid parking. That doesn't need to be the case. We really advocate for starting small, taking a transitional approach, especially in communities where you have a small staff, and I'm sure most of the communities we work with don't have staff that are jumping up and down hoping that parking will end up on their list of responsibilities. But starting small, taking a transitional approach, starting things like even just delineating the public right of way from private land and space is one first step. Setting goals. So parking should really be part of a robust strategy, your comprehensive planning effort, your transportation master plan effort. Include parking as part of that conversation. So any parking management effort or initiative you take is part of your overall goals. And that's especially important when we're talking about zoning code regulations and the like. Sharing the vision with the community. So getting the community as a collaborative partner from the beginning of these initiatives is so important and really makes implementation very, very smooth. If the community is not on board, we've seen paid parking initiatives fail, we've seen parking management initiatives fail because the community was not, part of the conversation from the beginning. And then, really a focus on implementation, and that's, Andrew and I will tell you all day that we really focus our practice on making real and demonstrable change in communities. We go to these communities, we want to see our work actually have a functional difference on the ground. And so focusing your effort from on implementation from the beginning is really so important. So we talked kind of throughout this presentation on about the scale and the lack of a one-size-fits-all approach. There is not a silver bullet that will perfect your parking management system. It really is a journey. It's a long slog. It's a marathon, not a sprint. I know some of you will be saddened to hear that, but I think a lot of communities, if you're over here on this level 1 scale, you're really just beginning this journey. You're maybe just starting to delineate the differences between what's public right-of-way and what's private land. Communities in this category might be dealing with things like extensive vehicle storage in the right-of-way. So I saw the town of Eagle is represented here, a wonderful community that we've had the pleasure of working with. They were really struggling when we worked with them on private landowners using the public right-of-way to store RVs, cars that were no longer road safe, really taking advantage of using the public right-of-way for that purpose. And the city or the town really wanted to use that public right-of-way as a public space. So just starting to delineate and enforce those basic rules is a really important step. And then, you're getting into enforcement, you're maybe getting into delineating space in the right-of-way for bikes, transit, and then all the way over at 6 and 7, you're starting to monetize the right-of-way. So no matter where you are at in this journey, there's opportunities for growth, expansion, improvement in the name of economic growth and development, and any step is a good step. So now we're going to learn a little bit more about parking management in your community, maybe some of the challenges that you've experienced in implementing or advancing parking management efforts. So Drew is going to share that again, and we're going to return to www.menti.com and input that code that you'll see on the screen, 8096-6306. So Drew, if you could share that, and we'll get some more interaction going. Awesome. So this first question focused on, in your community, what are you most focused on doing? What are you most excited about doing? I'm excited to see that some folks are just starting to think about parking management. That's exciting, or not yet even having considered parking management. So we hope to have shared some of the benefits of thinking about that. And then we have some folks on the other end of the spectrum thinking about ways to monetize parking in the curb. And when we say monetize, we really mean ascertaining the value of that curb space. I think that's one of the misconceptions is, hey, it's just, a block of concrete part of our street. But it really, as city leaders, you all know that that's expensive to operate and maintain. So that's great to see. Others are just starting to enforce rules and regulations, or prioritizing other modes of transportation. Great mix in this audience.
The one thing I would add, Mallory, looking at the people that are the communities that are just starting to think about parking management, or the communities that are focused on, other modes of transportation, we talk about this holistic approach, and goal setting is a really important first step to understand what your priorities are in your community. And if parking isn't the first priority, that's perfectly okay. I think about, being in Steamboat last weekend and worrying more myself about, I don't want to get back in my car. I want to be able to access not only the resort, but I want to go downtown because I need to pick some things up to take back home. And not wanting to get in my car was like my focus. So my strategy was, let me get my car parked for the weekend, and then I can use the transportation system. So these parking management strategies don't have to be just solely focused on making sure we can collect money from cars, or making sure that we're moving cars around. It's about making sure that where appropriate, we can put the priority on other transportation systems. And I think that's a great way in that goal setting stage to understand where those priorities lie.
Absolutely, and I think the prioritizing certain modes of travel, frequently we focus so much on the incentivization part of that conversation, and we forget that the stick is a really important tool. We worked on a project over in Dallas, where the city was really excited about implementing this autonomous transportation system as a primary circulator in a new master plan district. And we said, you have to start with parking, because if you provide parking at all these different places, guess what? People are going to just drive from place to place because that's the default, and no one will use this fantastic autonomous transportation system, even though it's a wonderful option. So really focusing on parking management can actually really enhance your transportation demand management efforts. And I want to shout out to Boulder again. You know, having worked with Boulder and over the last year and a half, they really prioritize access and transportation demand management, but they start with parking. So let's go to the next question. When it comes to parking management, what gets you the most excited? And that might be a relative term. I'm sure we're less excited about parking management than we are about getting out on the slopes this weekend. But if you are excited about parking management, ranking these different components: economic growth for downtown, improved access for all parker types, educating my community. Not surprising that economic growth for my downtown, when that's kind of the focus of this webinar, is coming out on top. I think education of the community is something that I'm not surprised that folks are not as excited about, because sometimes community engagement, you know, it's a hard thing, it's an emotional thing, but really, again, just bringing the community along in those conversations can make implementation so much smoother.
Yeah, the thing about economic growth in a community, and we're just here to talk about parking and transportation management today, but that's just one of many pieces of economic success. Our communities have to have a reason to go there, a destination for people, something that gets them excited. And parking management and access management is that first piece that makes it successful or not. You know, there's very few stories we hear about, you couldn't believe my trip to Grand Junction this weekend. I had the best parking experience, and oh, by the way, we did all these things, right? It's completely the opposite if it's not well done. This was such a nightmare because I was parking in this community this weekend and I couldn't get to the restaurant easily because it was too far. It was -5 degrees last Saturday night. And so I didn't want to walk. I couldn't walk that far. You know, we had small kids, or whatever your personal story is or the complaints you've heard, those situations make that economic vibrancy less impactful and less likely. So we want the story to be the front end where you don't remember your parking experience because it was just easy.
Yeah, totally agree. I love that, because it's so true that if you do parking well, no one ever talks about it. But if you do it wrong, it's the only thing people will talk about. All right, let's move on to the final question. What makes managing parking a hard choice for you and your team? So maybe, you know, if you are already managing parking, what makes taking that next step challenging? Or if you're not managing parking yet, what are the reasons why you're maybe taking a step back from that? Yeah, fun. Politics is always a big one, especially for our elected official friends. You know, parking can be a third rail issue. It can be really emotional, a very difficult topic to bring up, and maybe a challenge in your future election. So we definitely talk to a lot of communities where politics are an issue, but again, bringing the community along and establishing that mutual benefit, being transparent about if you are raising funds through paid parking revenues, where is that going? How is that benefiting me? That's what I care about, you know. Everyone is pretty individualistic. How is this benefiting me and my family? Those conversations can be really interesting and important. And then no interest in the business owners or community. That's something we hear about a lot, you know, especially in communities that are historically a little bit less dense and less populated. As they get denser, get more economic growth, then parking becomes a problem. And bringing along those business owners and the community as a whole is really important. And again, establishing that benefit of what's in it for me. I like
think the
seeing we
last
don't
thing
have a problem.
the last thing I would add about this, right, and Mallory talked about this, but it's the why. The why are we doing managed parking, or why do we need to do managed parking? We have goals that we need to support in our communities, and we want those impactful changes in a positive way to not negatively impact our businesses, not impact our residents. And so explaining the rationale behind why this is important is sometimes one of the more important steps. And if you get that done successfully on the ground floor of, you know, planning for a parking program, planning for a new change, trying to understand where the funding comes from, the confusion about the money grab or the impactfulness, you know, negatively kind of goes away. And so we find that that's a really important step in the process.
Yeah. And I see that funding is also a major challenge, and that's not surprising either, especially in communities where, you know, you have a lot of competing needs for your general fund and the funding that you do have available, and parking sort of falls by the wayside. But when we think of parking more as access and managing access to our destinations, it kind of becomes more important. And we've definitely worked with quite a few communities that have limited staff resources and have still been able to make strides in updating and increasing and expanding their parking management systems without adding new staff or excessive capital costs, new technology, that sort of thing.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for your input and engaging with us. We'll switch back to a closing slide and kind of final remarks, and then we want to make sure that we have time available to answer questions. I know there's probably some things that you want to ask. You know, I will tell you that for me, I'm passionate about this because parking is an important piece of our communities and the success that our communities face. While I live in the Front Range, I spend a tremendous amount of time up north and in the mountains, and then kind of the western slopes. So it's important to me as a Coloradan and as a recreator of our outdoors and our downtowns that our communities can thrive and be a place that we want to go to. And, you know, the stake in it is if we succeed together, our communities succeed, our residents succeed, and everybody has really a great time coming to do whatever they're doing in our community aside from park.
Yeah. And we're here to help. We really hope to hear from you and continue the conversation. Andrew and I could both talk about this topic all day. So if you're struggling, if you need somebody to talk through an issue with, we're always happy for you to reach out.
So with that, we'll conclude the formal part of our discussion and the information sharing. Thank you for joining us. We'll turn it back over to McKenna to help facilitate the Q&A session.
Thank you so much. That was great. We do have a quick question that came in. So this is a long-winded one, so it's a lot of information to gather at once. If you look at an aerial photo of our downtown, there's a lot of underutilized parking, but there's a perception that there's a shortage and more structures should be built. Most of this parking is privately owned. How do we get these individual landowners with plenty of available parking to come together to make their parking available to downtown visitors when they feel that making parking available to everyone will hurt their businesses? And if there's any piece of that that you need me to repeat, let me know.
That's a really good question. And I can tell you that you're not alone. in your situation, one of the things that's important is bringing stakeholders together. And stakeholders could be the municipality, the town, the county, whoever, whatever jurisdiction you represent. It could include some of the larger private landowners. In a resort community like Steamboat or Breckenridge or Vail, or Summit County in general, we talk about why that is super important. And if we're working with the municipality or working with the resort, or in some cases, a private landowner, we encourage everyone to get to the table and talk about it together, because building more parking isn't always the right solution. In some cases, it may be necessary, but we want to make sure that if we can have open and honest dialogue, we can talk about opportunities to share resources, break down some of the boundaries and the concerns of, that people have over resource sharing. Also, I can think about Manitou Springs is a great example. Again, not knowing what community's asking that question, they have a lot of parking, that's highly congested in the summers in the core downtown, but there's parking on the periphery that we want to be able to utilize. And so seasonal shuttle programs are another great way to be able to draw from the unused parking supply in the community.
Yeah, if I can add a couple things to 100% in agreement with what Andrew said. Number one, getting that stakeholder group together of your main owners will be so important, not only to kind of bring them on board, but also to understand what their actual grievances or concerns are. It might not just be concern about using parking. It might also be concerns about insurance, or what happens if people throw a bunch of trash on my lot, who's responsible for cleaning it up. These are all things that we've heard. Number two, once you have them on board with the project in itself, collecting data. Hard data is your friend, and doing some actual inventory and occupancy counts will make huge strides in assuaging some of those concerns about, we don't have enough parking, and be understanding how much parking you actually have, what the availability is, and sort of mitigating some of those concerns about them losing access to that parking. And number three, putting together, and we've worked with, for example, Rapid City, South Dakota is one community we've worked with that has this problem. They don't have a ton of publicly owned parking, but they have a lot of underutilized private parking. So one of the things that we did with them is we came up with sort of a shared parking agreement with specific stipulations and concerns addressed. For example, those insurance concerns and those operations and maintenance concerns. And we also created a shared parking database where private owners could sort of put their parking on the market, if you will. So those are all sort of concrete ways that you can mitigate some of those challenges, and also maybe think about stopping the bleeding a little bit. Are your parking requirements too high for new development? Could you maybe pull back some of the control as a city and look to some publicly owned parking, maybe getting a parking lease on some of those private lots, rather than allowing for more development to come in and build even more underutilized parking that's privately owned? So it all starts with getting folks together and having a conversation, but those are some ways that we would mitigate that challenge.
Wonderful, thank you. The next one asks, can the shoot method be effective in a smaller city like Durango? I feel like I need to be sold on how adjusting parking meter prices based on demand will help us avoid pushing parking further out of our downtown area and into our neighborhoods.
So by the shoot method, you mean demand-based pricing?
I believe so.
Okay, because Donald Shoup has a couple of different major initiatives, one of which is eliminating parking minimums. But yeah, demand-based pricing, it's a complicated initiative to actually implement. I would say that demand-based pricing is great in theory. Don Shoup, a wonderful person, has been in the ivory academic tower for many, many years. And so I think, actual municipalities have trouble implementing demand-based pricing primarily because it requires a substantial amount of technology to implement in earnest. But tiered pricing, for example, the city of Boulder, we assisted with a sort of pseudo demand-based pricing program with tiered pricing in different corridors based on an aggregate understanding of demand. So that means, their hottest corridors are more expensive than their least hot corridors. They also have a neighborhood parking permit program. So I think you're talking about, as we kind of adjust those prices and as we may be thinking about paid parking in general, what's going to happen to our neighborhoods. And I think, it's a combination of things. Number one, yeah, you can think about a residential parking permit program or a neighborhood parking permit program. Those have their own challenges, of course, because you are giving up some semblance of control of the public right of way and sort of creating the sense of entitlement over the public right of way, which can be a challenge, but also improving your other access techniques. Can we look at active transportation infrastructure? Can we look at transit programs to reduce reliance on single occupancy vehicles more generally? And that's kind of what I would recommend. But a true demand-based pricing program like we see in San Francisco will not be a feasible reality for most small communities just because of the staff and capital expenses that it necessitates.
Yeah, another way is variable rate pricing and that tiered pricing that Mallory talked about. So the most important spaces or the ones that are most desirable maybe have the higher price. And so the farther you get away from the core, the parking could be less. A couple of other strategies, which I think it really depends on your community, and I guess we'd want to kind of understand more the impacts that you're having in Durango. But Estes Park, for example, has seasonal paid parking. So during the summer months, they have paid parking implemented in the downtown core. Bozeman actually is moving from a free parking system that's time limited enforced to paid parking, and they're looking at one option being just seasonal in the summer months. So I could think how, Durango is a year-round destination for sure, but you certainly have your seasonal months that have higher demand. And so that's a way of applying the shoot method in a scalable context. Breckenridge did that for a long time where they only had paid parking in the winter months. And then during slack season, there was no parking enforcement at all. And then the summer, they just did time limited parking. That community's moved now to year-round paid parking. So that's one of those situations where it's kind of a transitional, where you start small and build over time.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome, thank you. So the next one asks, what are some tools you could suggest to manage parking besides paid or time limited, particularly in neighborhoods?
Andrew, do you want? I guess neighborhood parking permit programs are an option. They have some challenges, which is why we don't really recommend them for every community. I think it really is so dependent on your community. And I would start with, again, thinking about what are your goals? I think there's not a one size fits all approach that's perfect for every location. That's why different cities and communities approach this differently. And I think I would start with, look at your comp plan, look at your transportation master plan if you have one, and see, what are the parking management techniques that might get us to where we want to go. And that might be a neighborhood parking permit program or resident parking permit program. It might be implementing shuttles or looking at some TDM techniques. It might be updating your regulations or using the private business owners to leverage some of their private parking for the public market. So there are different ways to approach it. And again, I would start with A, looking at what your goals are more broadly, and B, collecting some data. Collecting data is really important.
I think I'd want to understand more about why specifically in the neighborhoods. I can think back to some work that we did in Eagle County, and it was in an area of the county where it was a neighborhood, no curb and gutter, gravel, ditch, and drainage. And one of the challenges that they were having was not so much that vehicles and trailers were parked on the side of the road, but during maintenance seasons, so in the summer, making sure that the drainage ditches were cleared and we had good water flow. The situation they had was if there was a half a dozen trailers with, ATVs in the way, that it made it difficult for maintenance operations. Again, in the winter, it would probably be more focused on snowmobiles and snowmobile trailers and plowing and making sure that there's good emergency access. So understanding the why is going to be important for that question. But then also, time limits may not be 2-hour parking, but it may be we have to do street sweeping operations the third Tuesday of the month in this neighborhood. And so it's really communicating, you're welcome to park there, but we need you to move your RV during these time periods, and posting and communicating that information is maybe another important strategy to consider, so people know that there's a particular operation issue that has to be taken care of.
Yeah, and Eagle interestingly already had those regulations on the books. They had if you don't move your car in 72 hours, it's going to get towed. But they were not capable of enforcing it, or had not put the emphasis on enforcing it for a long time. So you had the right of way, the town's ownership of the right of way was reduced. So they couldn't do snow plowing or utility, these basic functions of the town. So A, communication, and B, enforcing regulations that are already in ordinance is a great first step in neighborhoods. And then you can look to other techniques. But as Andrew mentioned, and I mentioned before, there's no perfect solution, which is probably why, companies like Walker are still in business, because it takes study and, rigorous effort and data collection to come up with something that will actually work.
Wonderful, thank you. It looks like we've got time for just a couple more questions. So the next one asks, limited downtown space wasn't really mentioned, especially in a historic downtown where building a parking garage may not be an option due to historic development restrictions or one-way streets with limited parallel parking. Do you have any suggested approaches to keep downtown revitalized and relevant when both visitors and residents bring up parking issues regularly?
That's a really good question, and we've worked with a couple of different communities that are in historic districts. One of the things that is most important, and I talked about at the very beginning, is making sure that we're providing the right parker types with the right spaces. And so if we want to provide good access to our customers, we need to make sure that our business owners and our employees are not taking the spaces envisioned for customers. And so that means we need to provide programs and strategies for those employees and business owners to park maybe a little bit farther away so those customers have space. If our customers can't get to our businesses, our customers can't spend money, and our businesses are not able to thrive. So the communicating of the why of that, first of all, is important. The second part of that is the residents. And that's a tricky situation because our residences, and a lot of times, need to be able to load and unload groceries or get the kids in the car. And so we don't have the ability to move them out farther away. So we would want to talk about and consider kind of permit exemptions for those users. The second thing I'll speak to is the nature of a historic district in being able to add structured parking or surface parking if you need to. There are ways architecturally to blend in parking so it doesn't look like just a parking structure. We can use those community design standards to be able to have them match the surrounding landscape. I can think of, one example, probably the most recent from a design perspective, is the town of Breckenridge. They just opened a new parking garage to support the winter ski season. Now, I should tell you it's on a different scale than a downtown historic neighborhood, but it has character and architecture that by no means would you say this is a traditional parking structure. So from a design perspective, you know, we can take into consideration some of those things. If it's not a parking structure and it's a parking lot, we can add architectural elements to kind of blend or mask the fact that it is surface parking.
So just a couple of things to add. I mean, the vast majority of communities I would say we work in Colorado have historic downtowns that have the challenges that you're talking about. So I think all the solutions that we talked about in the presentation are feasible for you as well. But a couple of things that I would mention. Number one, managing your turnover in your on-street space. Your on-street spaces are going to be the king in a historic downtown. So really focusing on managing turnover of those spaces is so important. If you have folks parking in that on-street inventory for 8-10 hours a day, that's effectively reducing the inventory you have. So it's really important to focus on turnover. And number two, looking at ways to make peripheral parking more feasible and attractive. So one, your regulatory context in your land use development code, I would consider maybe requiring 50% ground floor retail frontage if you're not already doing so, to make the pedestrian walk around your downtown more pleasant, more connected. Number two, really shoring up your active transportation infrastructure, even things like patching up sidewalks or making sure there's continuity of sidewalks can be really important in facilitating a park once environment. And number three, signage and wayfinding is a huge initiative and effort that you can take to direct people away from your downtown into those peripheral parking areas if you have them, and then bringing them into your downtown after the fact.
Thank you. So looks like we've just got one more, and then we will go ahead and follow up with folks offline if that's all right with you guys. I can just go ahead and send you their questions and contact information.
Perfect.
So this question asks, how well does a parking cash out program work in shifting modes from SOBs to walking, biking, and other modes of transportation?
I'm assuming that you're talking about a parking, let's see, a parking cash out program is traditionally thought of as an employer option. So if you're providing a parking permit, you're giving the value of that permit to an individual to spend in other ways. I don't know off the top of my head, and Andrew might, the actual SOB reduction or mode split reduction or mode split push that can incentivize. We probably have some data on that, and it's pretty community dependent, and it depends. It's so dependent, in fact, on what alternatives you have. You know, parking cash out program doesn't really matter that much if parking is your only option. So if you have a strong transit, even like a bike share environment, then parking cash out could work pretty well. So in a pretty dense urban environment, that could have a pretty substantial benefit. But if you're just, you know, giving people the monetary value of a parking permit and saying, hey, you know, spend this on something else, but driving and parking is the only way that they can get to work conveniently, then they're going to spend it on parking somewhere else or in your on-site structure or lot. So it's really community dependent. We can definitely, McKenna, if you get us the contact information of that person who asked that question, we can follow up with some data that we have. Andrew, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, so parking cash out programs are successful, but parking cash out programs require that this carrot and stick, and parking needs to be the stick in this case to make it priced so that taking the bus, taking light rail, walking, biking, carpooling, vanpooling is much more attractive financially. When that's the case, they work pretty well. In Colorado, you know, unless you live in a dense core, it's kind of difficult to work because parking usually is cheap enough that it's not a big dissuader to actually use that program. Large, dense communities, like we think of our coastal communities, and I'm going to use an extreme to demonstrate this, but Seattle, San Francisco, New York, Boston, where parking is really, really expensive, especially proportional to Denver, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, and Boulder. It's just not expensive enough to be a big enough dissuader and inconvenience that parking cash out programs work. But when you layer on incentives that go with the monetary things, there's been some private businesses that have done some pretty cool things like extra vacation days, or if they have a restaurant on site, we'll provide you lunch. We will give you a more flexible schedule. And this was probably like pre-pandemic more, but you can leave at 3 o'clock to go home so you can take the early train and you're home by 5. Those are the kind of layer cake pieces that would make those programs more successful.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I guess to wrap up, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we hop offline?
I would just say that, every community is in a different spot and everybody's situation is different. We can be here to help as a voice, as a resource. And, we know that you talking to your peers is an important part of that conversation. So let us help be that facilitator and point you in the direction to carry on a conversation with other communities that have had these challenges or are currently experiencing it. That peer-to-peer connection, I think, is an important piece to understand that you're not alone, and we're here to, help answer questions and get you going in the right direction. So don't feel hesitant to reach out. Your problem is not ever too small and not ever too big, and the opportunities that go with that sometimes can be relatively easy. So we know that in your positions as mayors and town administrators, council, isn't just parking. So let us help provide you the resources to make your lives easier and have your communities thrive. And thank you again to McKenna and the Colorado Municipal League and those that joined us today. We hope that the investment of your time has been beneficial to you.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll follow up offline with folks who didn't get their questions answered. And you'll also get a follow-up email from me with a link to the recording and the presentation materials. So we really appreciate your time and hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you.